The Aurora Memoirs by Thomas Michael. Chapter 2. The Ember. So much of my psychic intuitive sensitivities were still heightened. Much of my experience most people would liken unto a psychedelic trip. I would many times be hanging out in my playpen with my mother and father. They might have friends over, or perhaps a TV was on. As those around me would speak, in my mind's eye, I could visually see the imprints of the origin of the energy within them. Beyond this, I could feel whatever energy or emotion or sensation the words were emanating from. Oftentimes, this might be a painful memory stored within the person's psyche or nervous system, one their conscious mind was completely unaware of. Imagine for a moment someone saying, "I love you," one of the most precious phrases a human can hear or say in this life. Waiting to hear back the response all beings wish to hear in return. Only when I would hear these words, sometimes, like a lightly faded scene of a movie, I would be able to see the memory of their own wounded inner child, feeling abandoned, longing for a moment of connection that they never got. As my identity was forming, my brain learning the ways and language of this world, this was a stark contrast to a place where we would sing worlds into being from pure life. Feeling the dissonance between the intended meanings of the word and the place from which the person that they were coming from was world-shattering, to say the least. What was even more impactful for me, still being connected to Aurora, was witnessing the weaponizing of words, whether conscious or unconscious. Seeing how these words carried the pain of these imprints and then inflicted those energies into both the world and the aura of the other person, like a frequency virus being passed along, only to later affect and inflect more of what it would come in contact with as it grew. What witnessing this terrifying reality did was create the conditions for me to disconnect from certain depths of my own power. For even without the cognitive development as an adult, my being knew on a cellular level that our human bodies have the potential for both a temple of creation and destruction as a weapon. Like a hacker writing his own failsafe, knowing he might one day be under the mind control of the enemy. Sensing a deeper layer of these traumas within my bloodlines, through my own body and the world around me. Around this time, I would seal myself out of access to some of these layers in my own temple, to ensure that only once much of this had been purified would I want to give myself access to that kind of power. And thus, for a time, I had also placed the flaming sword in front of the gates of Eden and its tree of life within me. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So many of the Bible translations have said. Though neither of my parents resonated deeply with traditional Christianity and its official church-going sects, between the ages of 2 and 4, my mother found her way to a small group called the Way International, which focused specifically on the gifts of Holy Spirit, speaking in tongues, healing, and even miracles. They connected these practices strongly to the last days before Christ's return, and an increase in what they called signs and wonders. For a child who incarnated from a place where we sang reality into being, something about this practice immediately rang true. Even as much of Christianity felt foreign to me, I often found myself opening up to speaking in tongues myself, though I was uncomfortable with interpreting them. Some part of me felt it was something to be felt by each individual, without the filter of the English language, to be experienced directly by each person as the vibration and sensation itself. This, of course, is another manifestation for what modern spiritual people refer to as light language. This experience of speaking in tongues, for me, was just a natural extension of the connection I still had to Mother, Father, God from Aurora. I would connect to God through my heart, through the central pillar of my body, until my body became an instrument of the sounds, and then the language would pour out of me. As I grew older and conditioning came in from others around religion, and Christianity especially, I lost touch with this ability, and even took on a deeper wound around connecting to God in this way at all. One of the first most subtle, yet powerfully shattering initiations into the illusion of separation is the name and the effects of its imprinting. Another seed sown into the mind and aura, and with it often a passing of the mind virus. To be taught, I am this and not that. And when it becomes truly problematic is when these effects are compounded with the weaponization I spoke of earlier. Words charged with emotion, to have one's name said with shame or anger, or to witness another person or object named in this way. I remember one time as a child reaching for something my mother didn't want me to touch. I could feel the fear and anger rising in her as my hand moved towards it. That energy then transmitting through my name as she spoke it, shocking me into fear, not only of her disapproval, but of the innocent sense of autonomy I had been expressing. Something that once felt like a natural extension of myself suddenly became dangerous. It wasn't long before we moved again, this time out of the Detroit area and up into Michigan farmland, closer to my mother's family. This side of my ancestry was of mostly Celtic bloodline and descent, which had played a major role in the assignments of this incarnation. Its grand love story across time and space, and the role that it played in the upholding of human history and of poetic divine orchestration. My family lived on a small 5-acre plot surrounded by forest and farmland. So often I found myself going out to the forest and speaking to the trees, connecting to the fairies and fae, elementals, birds, rocks, and crystals. I'm still grateful every day for this beautiful opportunity that I had as a child. I felt more at home in the forests, whether those around my childhood home or nearby at my grandmother and grandfather's acreage. This was where I felt most connected, wandering into the forests, communing with the trees, listening to the language and orchestration of these energies, moving through them, the birds and animal songs orchestrating their harmony together. I would sit on the needles of the pine forest floor as the sun came in, heating up and creating that unforgettable smell. Or perhaps sitting with my back against the sugar maples, allowing myself to breathe with the breeze, connecting deeply with all of life. Often I would meditate under those trees. The energies I would experience in these moments were the closest things that I often had to the form of connection and communication that I remembered from Aurora. The cosmic giggle, once again still echoing out, which would later reveal itself as the living out of simultaneous lives within just this one. Although it didn't make a connection until later in life, this childhood home on a road named Murray Road. If you break this down, of course, this harkens back to the Mu, Ray, with connections to many of my past lives in Mu, known as the Mother of Lemuria. Key connections, of course, that would unfold later on in my life and in this story. This depth of relationship with the forest would ebb and flow throughout my life, but would dwindle as I grew from a child to a younger adult. When video games really hit the scene, so much shifted in Midwest culture. Both my best friend and older cousin were really into them as soon as they came out. The social influence of both, along with the bright colors which were particularly entrancing to someone who from a realm of liquid light. Aurora had its own luminosity, and these digital colors, as crude as they were by comparison, still carried enough of that frequency to hook something deep within me. I remember the first time seeing Space Invaders game on Atari at my older cousin's. I wasn't much into it, but then my best friend got Mario and Duck Hunt on Nintendo. I got dropped off at his house one day, and he was pointing a plastic gun at the TV, pulling the trigger, and those little ducks on the screen were falling down. He said, "Here, you try." I was quickly sucked in, and I would be up late at night playing for hours during sleepovers. Soon after this, by the time Street Fighter came out on Super Nintendo, a great part of my attention and connection to the forests had faded for the drug-like rush and competition of the games. Looking back, I can see how perfectly designed it all was, not necessarily by sinister intent, but by the accumulated momentum of a culture that had long since forgotten what the forest was actually for. Without a deeper validation of what I was experiencing in nature and my psychic intuitive abilities, the dream and illusion of society and the identities that came with it began to become more solid. The love, connection, and reality of natural worlds began to fade more and more. The creative life force that I had adapted to feed the realities given in cartoons, action movies, and were enforced by modern schooling. Years later, I got into the science of brainwave states. How when we enter into the trance of alpha state, it allows our DNA to receive visual and emotional imprinting. Between the games and cartoons, the depths of my available consciousness began to drown in these digital realities. These influences had a way of shifting my relationship to the forest to become more about its utility, dampening my sensitivity to the deeper layers of communion with both nature and my body, which of course ultimately are one and the same. Where once I sat with my back against ancient willows, Aurora dancing with the web of life, I then sat back against the gaming chair, controller in hand, Aurora battling characters on the screen. My grandmother's and my connection to her were one of the most profound and instrumental relationships in my upbringing. Coming from my mother's side, she was, as far as I was aware, 100% Scottish in blood, and still retained a deep connection to ancient Celtic lore, a fascination with trying to understand and study what might be available to her despite the decimation of the spirituality and culture in those lands and traditions. She was extremely interested in researching and finding out the origins of our clan and bloodline history, and we deeply connected on this note. She had a couple of books with stories on Celtic folklore that I found myself diving into often. My grandmother was also a painter and very artistic, though not extremely vocal about it. You could just tell in her bones that she retained a deep connection to the land and the spiritual qualities of life. She was a beautiful artist, and we would connect on her encouragement of my interest in art, drawing, and painting, which flourished early on in my life as well. Most notably, she would love and encourage my connection to nature. Her favorite things to paint were trees and different nature scenes, and she keenly saw my connection to the trees. One of the most beautiful things she pointed out early in my life, seeing my depth of connection to the trees, was to point to them and say, "You know, every single tree has a face on it." And still to this day, if you look to the trees at the right angle of light, you can find the face in the arcs and angles and the shadows of how the leaves play. She would often hide these faces in the leaves of the trees that she painted. When we would connect about our Scottish heritage, I somehow always felt a deep connection to Native American ways and traditions. Although supposedly on the surface, my family wasn't aware of proof of Native American heritage in our background, there were often whispers and stories of the potential of it being in the family, hidden further back. But in the depths of my soul, as I would hear and read the stories in school or encyclopedias, or see the artwork, I felt a depth of ancient connection. Perhaps just a similarity in our Celtic lineage that I didn't quite understand as a child. As soon as I was old enough to find myself being surrounded by other children regularly outside of my family lineage, daycare, kindergarten, or preschool, I quickly found myself reminded of knowing from somewhere deep within my being that I had only one true beloved, or a counterpart in this life that I was seeking to find, an intuitive recognition of someone specific that I was searching to reconnect with. The way that I recognized this, even at a young age, was that when I would meet a certain girl, they would trigger some sort of energetic familiarity in me. Although I didn't know what sparked it, looking back, it was perhaps a similar look or a feeling, a soul fragment, or a genetic background. When I would meet them, I would become rather entranced or infatuated, feeling this sense of something missing, longing to be fulfilled in the connection. As the relationship with this person would play out in whatever form, it would often be very challenging for me to let go of thinking and feeling that I wasn't destined to be with this person. If they didn't return these feelings, I would find it heart-crushing and devastating, solidifying my wounds and longing, even at a very young age. The intensity of this love often made no sense to the girls or women that I would encounter as I grew older. Most friends and family also had no frame of reference for the depth of what I was experiencing. Looking back, this intense dynamic made much more sense once I gained back the deeper layers of my memories of Aurora and the abrupt exit that ensued. It was about this time in my life that I gradually started to become aware of this burning ember within the depths of my heart. The more that I moved forward into the traumas, programs, and conditions of the illusions of separation of the human identity, the personality, and the story, the more I started to become aware of the burning and smoldering of this ember. This ember was many things. This ember was a remembrance of home, seemingly outside of the reality of this planet of Earth. This ember, in the same way, an ember of a sacred fire longs for more fuel, to reconnect, or to be fueled by the larger fire and more embers. This ember was also a longing and a remembrance of my one true beloved in Aurora. This ember, as I moved forward, started to serve as my compass and my guide. There were certain things that would activate and fuel this ember, as if the ember itself was a seed of a star planted in my heart before I arrived. As I would move forward with my life, I would have an awareness of a frequency resonation with a particular person or a place or something that would in some capacity grow and fuel the burning of this ember, igniting it to a greater capacity. The next major event that I can recall that would play a massive role in solidifying the illusionary human identity, the strike and personality disconnection from Aurora, along with some layers of my psychic intuitive abilities, took place around the 2nd grade. During this era in the Midwest education system, it was a common practice to teach children cursive writing. The etymology hidden in the name itself, cursive writing, should provide clues to the reality of what was actually happening in this process. We would be forced to use this specific type of paper where the letters would be traced over lined surfaces, repeated endlessly until we learned this way of writing. It would be years before I discovered why I had felt so deeply about this, even the justification of my anger. These forms we were forced to trace carry more significance than most people believe. And the hidden history here was even connected to my own ancestry, a conversation for a future chapter. I remember one day in particular, sitting down at my little ceramic desk, gray recycled paper pushed in front of me with its pre-etched forms. I felt so much resistance, but I was forced to learn. My teacher said, "If you don't learn this, you won't pass this grade." As I sat there, I felt this part of me that still remembered Aurora, the ability to paint reality into being with my voice in real time, the depths of psychic intuitive communication in the liquid crystalline plasmas, this dance and this oneness. As I put my pencil down to the paper, I thought, what an absurd and archaic form of communication. Why do I have to learn this when I could read and sense another person's emotions, thoughts, or feelings? When there is such a much more evolved and advanced way of creation and communication. It wouldn't be for many years that I would return to this wound and imprint. It left a deep scar in my psyche. So much inner work within my genetics and psyche to clear these painful programs and imprints. But like all great wounds, when tended to, it rendered a profound medicine. This inner work led to a massive awakening later on in my life, providing a master key to the reason, purpose, and mission for my incarnation here in this reality. The cursive wound, the moment when the organic flow of consciousness was forced into rigid, destructive patterns, would become the very doorway through which I would later rediscover the authentic codes of creation that had been systematically programmed out of human awareness as a whole. Once I did learn to read and write, the wound, the disconnection from my innate inner knowing, left me infatuated with books. My parents had an incredible library for a small Midwest household, one that I was very grateful for. I would dive into all of those books, different mythologies, religions, spirituality, and deeply interested in reading the Bible. As I would read the Bible, though, certain things would just feel off, as they did with many other things. And I would ask my mom sometimes to clarify. I remember one time in particular, it was a midday afternoon, after lunch, the time I like to lay down and digest and spend some time reading. I hopped off the floor where I had been scanning the pages of the Bible, and onto our forest green lazy boy couch. I said to my mother, "So God is omnipotent?" "Yeah?" She nodded. "Also omniscient?" "Yes?" She nodded. "And also omnipresent?" She nodded. "Well, then that means that we're all God." And she said, "No, it doesn't work like that." It was at that key moment that I knew something was majorly off in this world, in this reality. Slightly perplexed, I walked outside to sit with this. This was one of the greatest ignition points for my need to truly figure out what was going on in this reality. And it would be a major addition to the burning ember to come to a depth of seeking and figuring out what was going on and felt so off, and what I was truly meant here to do. I would read stories of Christ and instantly felt a recognition, a resonation with his energy and his life. Even at a young age, I would read the stories of his life and feel that I was here to take a similar path, to go through things very similar to his stories in the New Testament. Yet at the same time, something didn't feel quite right about a number of the things that I read. Around the time that this ember began to be sparked by these recognitions, I had one of my notable first spiritual initiations. Having returned from hiking in the forest behind my grandmother's house, I sat on the steps of the back porch, looking out into the backyard, and looking across to the yard next to the barn. Out of the bushes, I saw a mountain lion. A mountain lion. Now, mountain lions aren't something that are very common in mid-Michigan at all, if ever. And I saw the mountain lion, and I was entranced, but also frozen. I felt the depths of the power in this key moment and wanted to share it with my family. So I did my best to quietly sneak inside. And when I returned, of course, the mountain lion was gone. But I will always remember the initiation of this moment and the medicine and energetics of the mountain lion. Its connection to self-leadership and stalking power alone in quiet places. This would reveal itself very quickly in my life after that moment. I spent a great deal of time in my grandmother and grandfather's house when I was growing up, about 7 miles away from where my family lived most of the time. My younger years were spent going back and forth between exploring the forests in the upstairs attic of the house. My grandparents had bought the land bare in the early 1900s and added the old grindstone home, made from hand-cut stone, grindstone, city grindstone. It's quite a marvel nowadays, even considered a historical landmark at this point. As I would wander upstairs, frequently exploring the boxes and storage that rotated different items from various members of the family, my biggest fascination, as in my own house, was the bookshelves. Most of the books on these shelves were of no interest to me in younger years. Novels too old, titles like Gone with the Wind. So I spent most of my time looking through my grandfather's books on different animal, bird species, rocks, minerals, crystals. I continuously combed through all of them in great detail, randomly picking up ones whose titles caught my eye, scanning the words to see if anything was of interest. This took place over many years and led to the one of the biggest initiatory moments of my earlier years and perhaps my life. For those of you unfamiliar with him, Carlos Castaneda was one of the most respected esoteric teachers of his time, a university student in California who was studying medicinal and theogenic plants. He decided to take his research further by searching for the original indigenous people who still carried the wisdom of the plants In searching the southern U.S. and northern Mexico, he encountered an ancient Toltec Yaqui elder he called by the name of Don Juan. Over the years, he wrote many volumes of books on his initiations with this elder master. One day, going upstairs as I usually did, I looked at the shelf and had to do a double take. A book that I had never before seen seemed to materialize out of nowhere right in front of my eyes. In the rolls of older dusty books, it stuck out like a bright sore thumb. As I grabbed it off the shelf and opened it up, it said, Carlos Castaneda, A Fire from Within. How poetic, considering the amount of fuel that it would add to my ember. As I opened the pages, I of course knew nothing about this individual. I opened to somewhere in the middle and read these words. To say that the indescribable force bestows awareness through its emanations is like what a religious man would say about God, that God bestows life through love. However, the two statements are not made from the same point of view, and yet I think they mean the same thing. The difference is that seers see how the angle of the indescribable force bestows awareness through its emanations, and religious men don't see how God bestows life through his love. My ember immediately ignited in a recognition of something that was undeniable to me. At this point, much of my psychic intuitive nature had begun to dull itself. Carlos Castaneda and Don Juan spoke of the warrior's ability to see beyond the veil. So close to a time when my soul had recognized this initiation from the mountain lion. I proceeded to run downstairs and ask my mother where the book had came from. She looked over and said, I've never seen it, and suggested that maybe it had belonged to my uncle back in his hippie days. Go ask your grandmother. I ran to my grandmother and showed her the book. She looked confused. She said she had also never seen it, but perhaps my mother was right. Perhaps it had been up there from your uncle's hippie days. And it wouldn't be for many, many years that I would discover how this book actually came to be in my possession. Needless to say, I eagerly combed through every word and immediately entered into a profound spiritual initiation, a quest to go deeper into this knowledge that rang truer than any other spiritual information that I had found at that point. It would take me years from then, still before the age of the internet, to acquire the rest of Carlos Castaneda's book series. But any chance or point that I would get, I would dive deeper into these books and put what I could into daily practice into my own life. Getting a little bit older, going to the public library, finding a couple here and there in my travels. This was a deep initiation. This was truly a deep ignition of my ember. I often tell many people that this was an instrumental moment of igniting my own fire from within in this quest for becoming, once again, an instrument of the infinite, following that path of the warrior to infinity, as Don Juan and Carlos Castaneda would call it. Following that path of the warrior to infinity, as Don Juan and Carlos Castaneda would call it. Thanks so much for listening. This has been Chapter 2 of the Aurora Memoirs. You can subscribe for free on Substack to receive each chapter delivered directly to your email inbox. The link is in the description. I'm Thomas Michael, and looking forward to having you for the next chapter.